access to the popular artificial intelligence tool GPT earlier this month. It was the latest response to concerns over how rapidly changing technology is affecting our lives. Educators worry that students are using this technology to write papers and that they'll never have to learn how to write on their own. The tool wasn't even a month old when a college professor caught a student using it to write an essay for her philosophy class. Darren Hick of Furman University wrote about that on his Facebook page, and he's with us now for our periodic series, The AI Frontier. Professor Hick, what were the red flags? This was an essay, for the record, about Scottish philosopher David Hume and the paradox of horror. As you were reading this essay, what were the red flags that this might have been other than her own product?
There's several red flags that come up in any case of plagiarism. They just sort of build up until you have to screech the grating to a halt and look into the problem. In this case, it got some basic issues exactly right, other things fundamentally wrong. It talked about things that the student wouldn't have learned about in class, which is always something of a flag, and connected things together in a way that was just thoroughly wrong, but it was beautifully written. Well, beautifully for a college take-home exam anyway. So it was a weird collection of flags.
You say these, were they different from the red flags you'd get from, I don't know, what we call, I guess we call old-fashioned plagiarism?
Well, normally what happens when a student plagiarizes, there's a sort of cost-benefit analysis that goes on, but usually it's a panic, right? At the end of the semester, they realize they don't have enough time or enough knowledge to put this thing together properly, and so they cobble pieces together that don't really fit together. What was odd about this is there was some of that. There was things that they didn't understand, things that they did understand or seemed to understand, but it was just so well composed, which is not something you would see with an essay that's cobbled together at the last second. It was nicely written, sentence by sentence. It was nicely structured. It was just really odd.
And you actually used a GPT product or part of this this tool to confirm the plagiarism.
That's right. There was a detector that was designed by the same lab that had created the GTP generator in the first place. And so I knew that this thing was around. So I thought, well, when I had these suspicions, let's plug it in and see what it has to say. At that point, I had never done anything with it. So this was new investigation for me.
What did you take away from this experience? What does this lead you to think about this technology, about the uses, the misuses of it? Do you have a policy about it in your class now? What do you walk away from this with?
I have a really ambivalent view on this. It's, on the one hand, it's fascinating. It's a great toy. I've been playing with it a lot. I can do all kinds of things with it. I had it write Christmas stories for me. It's just a lot of fun. On the other hand, it's terrifying. What's terrifying about it is that it's learning software. It's designed to get better. So when I caught the student using it, it was maybe 3 weeks old at that point, not even. And it was an infant, but a month from now, it's going to be better. A year from now, it's going to be better. 5 years from now, the genie's out of the bottle. So my worry is mostly about how do we keep up with this thing? How do we prepare for this thing? Plagiarism isn't anything new. I don't expect a new flood of plagiarists, but in that cost-benefit analysis that I was talking about, this changes the analysis for students. This is a tool that makes things easier, faster. And so my worry is that we'll get more students who are using this method, and we need to be prepared for that coming.
First became available in the United States, the federal government has been buying them from manufacturers and distributing them for free. But that was never intended to be permanent, and soon they'll be distributed by the manufacturers at prices they set. The government was paying $26 a dose for Moderna's updated boosters, but Moderna and Pfizer have both said they're considering a range of $110 to $130 a dose on the open market. Why the jump, and what does this mean for the future of vaccine costs as new variants emerge, especially for those without insurance? Jennifer Cates is Senior Vice President and Director of Global Health at KFF, the Kaiser Family Foundation. Jennifer, first let's be clear, that $110 to $130 range, what do those numbers represent?
So what we think they represent is what the manufacturers have said they might charge when the vaccines are in the commercial market. They could end up charging more, but this is what they're projecting. And essentially that would be the price per dose, about 4 or close to 5 times what the federal government paid even at the high end.
But who would they be charging that to?
Right, so there's good news and bad news here. The good news is that for most people with public or private insurance, we will not be paying for those vaccines. We are protected against costs. It's the buyers, the insurers, who are and the purchasers who are going to be paying that. And it is possible that will have a trickle-down effect on premiums and certainly will increase costs for the healthcare system. For individuals, most individuals with insurance will be okay.
So those may be good for dogs, but for you and me, maybe not so much. New research suggests that cold weather may actually affect the body's immune response, making us more susceptible to COVID, colds, flu, and other upper respiratory infections. Dr. Benjamin Bleier is a sinus specialist at Mass Eye and Ear in Boston. He teaches at the Harvard Medical School, and he's the senior author of this study. Dr. Bleier, have I got this right, that when it comes to fighting viruses, there is more going on, maybe not right under our noses, but more going on in our noses than previously understood?
Yes, that's right. In fact, what our study found, which takes off on some work we had done previously several years ago, was that inside the front of our noses, when we're exposed to a virus, there's a whole sort of war going on, whereas when our nose detects the presence of a virus, the cells release these swarms of bubbles, which we call vesicles, that have several functions. One is they actually bind to the virus. They stick to the viruses themselves, sort of mopping up the virus before it has a chance to infect our cells. But not only that, but these bubbles actually directly kill the virus when they bind to it. So essentially, these viruses don't have a chance to infect our cells because of these bubbles, these vesicles that get into our mucus.
And how does the cold affect us, or how does this change when it gets cold?
Well, what we found was that when the front of the nose is exposed to cold, and the way we looked at this is we actually took healthy volunteers and we measured the temperature of the front of their nose at room temperature and then at about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. What we found is that the front of the nose, the temperature drops by about 5 degrees Celsius or 9 degrees Fahrenheit. And in effect, just that modest drop in temperature decreases all of these immune functions of these little vesicles by about half. And so what that translates to is that there's about twice as much virus able to get into our cells and replicate just after exposure to this small drop in air temperature.
Is there a threshold? Is there a temperature at which below this really gets to be a problem?
Well, we only measured really this one drop, and we picked this number because this is sort of a typical winter that at least we would see here up in Boston. And what we found was that we could actually quantify and relate the degree of temperature drop to specific changes or decreases in our ability to fight these viruses. So this is really the first time that we've discovered a quantitative mechanism for how the cold impacts our nasal immunity and our ability to fight off viruses.
And does this change the thinking about why winter is sort of cold and flu season?
Well, this does, because, prior to this study, there's been a lot of sort of speculation as to why we see this very constant pattern year over year. As the temperature drops, we see higher rates of respiratory infections. People used to say that, well, maybe people are gathering more indoors and that's why. But we all know that in our modern society, we're indoors all year round. And other studies have looked at this where people get together, for example, during sports events, and they don't see these same types of effects. So really, we wanted to look at an actual mechanism that we could quantify. And this changes the way that we look at this, because now we know that the nose really has a very important role in not only protecting us from respiratory viruses, but also how that protection is impaired when we're exposed to, again, very, very modest changes in temperature.
Are there implications for how doctors treat colds and flu or prevent colds and flu?
Yeah, so the type of effect we're talking about is part of what we call our innate immune system. This is the part of our immune system that immediately protects us against viruses within minutes to hours of being exposed. What this tells us is, first of all, that things like masking are still very important, because not only does this prevent us from inhaling the virus for those viral particles to get into our nose, But we also think that in the cold months, maybe these masks also maintain this cushion of warm air in front of our noses and maybe prevent this reduction in temperature. But this also tells us that maybe as potential preventative therapies in the future, we could leverage some of our discoveries to actually fool the nose into thinking that a virus is present and increase or upregulate this dramatic immune response and maybe prevent us from getting infected in the first place.
Missiles targeted multiple Ukrainian cities today. The first time in nearly 2 weeks there's been an attack of that scale. In the southeastern city of Dnipro, Russian strikes leveled part of an apartment building, burying many people under rubble and killing at least 9. Early this morning, Kyiv was also targeted by strikes. This comes as the British today pledged state-of-the-art battle tanks to Ukraine, something the war-torn nation has sought for months. These will be the first modern Western tanks sent to Ukraine. Next week, the United States will lead a meeting of all nations that supply weapons to Ukraine, where more announcements of tanks are expected. And Robbie Knievel, the daredevil motorcyclist and son of legendary stuntman Evel Knievel, has died. His family said the cause was pancreatic cancer. Robbie Knievel made hundreds of heart-stopping jumps in his career, including vaulting a portion of the Grand Canyon in the 1990s, stunts that defied death and set records. Robbie Knievel was 60 years old.